All right, good afternoon, everyone. So, guiding teams and shaping a portfolio using Wardley maps and domain-driven design. Naming things is hard, right? So obviously you always realize last minute what the actual title should have been of a presentation. And this kind of domain-driven design does not exist in a vacuum. So this is me. Today, I'm going to be like this. It's all connected. No, my name is Marijn Huizendveld, and my company helps fast-growing organizations to accomplish more with the people that produce their software. And last year, I trained over 100 people in management and leadership positions about fostering an environment in which domain-driven design can come to fruition. And this was managers of companies with like 25 teams and up. All right, and so today I want to share some of the things I've observed and things I've learned along the way while interacting with these people. So if you have less than 5 teams, or if you really want to go for an in-depth discussion on this topic, or if you're new to domain-driven design and Wardley mapping, then I want to ask you to talk to me after this presentation, because I only have so much time. And so this is really tailored to 25 teams, right? Bigger organizations. I expect that you know some of domain-driven design and some of Wardley maps. It's okay if you want to leave now. I don't mind. And you can talk to me later, and then we can have an in-person conversation about this. All right. So, too long, didn't read, right? The summary. Are you ready for it? I know it was just lunch break, so the lunch break after dinner dip is kind of kicking in probably. But this is going to be intense. So a lack of situational awareness leads to painful situations when the market evolves. Okay? So if you do not understand the landscape that you operate in and the market evolves, and as we've seen in definitely this decade, quite a few big changes, right? Then you can get really surprised, unpleasantly surprised even. You might not be aware of that one manual step in your process that is now all of a sudden really killing you. Now, prioritizing that emerged situation is of little help because if lots of things receive priority, then actually nothing receives priority, right? You might think, oh, I'll just prioritize it, but what will happen is that there'll be multiple initiatives trying to deal with the same situation, and they'll be competing for resources. So priority-based sequencing doesn't really help address this issue. So it's constraints in the landscape that limit what can and what cannot be done. If you don't take constraints into account, then ultimately you as an organization will be fighting yourself, right? And so situational awareness, right, understanding your landscape, increases your constraint awareness, right? It makes you aware of these limitations that exist and that limit you. And it should be constraint alleviation that should drive the sequencing of initiatives in portfolio management, okay? So we should look at the constraints that exist in our landscape that limit us to do what we want to do, right? And it's those constraints that should drive the sequencing of the initiatives that we're chasing in our portfolio management process. And we can use domain-driven design, patterns, principles, and practices to then, once we figured out what we have to do, to align our systems with the value streams, right? And to surrender truly to the constraint. All right, so that was my talk. You're done. Yeah, well, save the best for the beginning, right? So in theory, how does this work, right? Well, in theory, the solution is this, right? What you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing Wardley mapping to gain situational awareness, right? You're going to work together with people that understand your business and your ecosystem very well, and you're going to make a map of the problem landscape and how you want to move in that landscape. And you're going to find initiatives, and you're going to say, these are the initiatives that we focus on given the constraints. And then you'll ultimately find that the value streams are not really aligned currently with where you'd like them to be, and so you can start to use different patterns, principles, and practices of domain-driven design to start to actually shift these boundaries, right? You can do event storming to discover where some of the pain points are, and then you can hide things behind good abstractions, and you can capture things in well-written tests and represent the model in the implementation, and then over time, with a lot of hard work, right? Because there is a lot of hard work involved in that, you will shift your boundaries. And then, in order to make sure that you're not overloading the system of work, right? You'll use that portfolio management process to constrain the work in progress. In theory, this should work. But we all know that theory is not practice, right? In practice, it is going to be like this. So we have to deal with reality. We have to make problems visible, right? We have to make tough decisions, and we have to iterate in that process on our strategy, right? Just as when we're practicing domain-driven design, right, we come up with a model, and then we don't come up with one model, right? We come up with multiple models, multiple options. We pick one where we think, well, we hypothesize that this one will get us closest to the goal, and then we'll start to implement, and we'll listen to the feedback that we're receiving while we're implementing this thing, and we're having that knowledge that starts to reveal itself to us. We have that sort of bubble up back to the modeling process, and we iterate on the model. But we have to do the same thing when we're doing strategy implementation, which is what we're doing here, right? We have to make these problems visible. We have to decide on how we want to deal with them. And then whenever we think we have a way to move forward with our strategy, we will inevitably figure out that our understanding of reality was slightly different. Or maybe the situation changed to some extent, and we have to iterate on our strategy. So basically what you're doing here is what a good DDDer does, just higher up in the stack, right? So what is portfolio management? Well, organizations have limited resources, right? But infinite ideas to improve. And so portfolio management is the process that resolves this tension by picking and evaluating initiatives that yield result. All right? So it is really limited resources, the process to resolve that tension, right? And figuring out, evaluating, and picking the initiatives that yield results. I can already hear you sigh, right? Oh my God, yet another thing we have to do on top of Agile, OKRs, 360 reviews, etc., etc., etc. So the thing is, you're already doing it, but probably not intentionally if you don't really have a real portfolio management process, right? So imagine a CTO and a CFO at a fast-growing company, all right? And they just raised 100 million euro, right? Because they have product market fit in a market in Europe, right? But they see, wow, we have a scalable business model here, right? So they go out to VCs and ask for a lot of money, and the VCs, they tell them, all right, let's grow this product, right? Here is a lot of money, and grow the organization and roll it out very aggressively in different markets. But one of the things they also want to do is they sell this product where you pay for it based on your consumption, right? So there is a consumable unit and you pay for it, and how much you pay for it depends on whether or not you have a subscription, if you maybe have prepaid bought a prepaid package, or a combination of these two things. Now, early on in the start of this company, they built their own custom billing and subscription management platform that allows them to do this, right? That allows them to send people the invoice for whatever it is they consumed at the right price. And the CTO and the CFO realize, all right, this is maybe not really going to work out that well for rolling out this aggressively in new markets where we think we have slightly different price sensitivity and where we really, in order to get to the 30, 40% growth expectations that come along with 100 million, we do really need to make sure that growth hackers can actually do the work, right? But right now, that entails going to a particular software team and saying, can you please fix this for me? And then we have to wait in line for that to actually get fixed. So they make an agreement together in the board and they say, we're going to buy something, right, in the market that does all of this for us. And then they all lived happily ever after. Well, it's a lack of situational awareness that leads to painful situations when the market evolves, right? So let's go back to that previous example, right? If you do not take into account, right, your ecosystem and your landscape, right, then you can get unpleasantly surprised when the market evolves, right? So if the market evolves and you suddenly have to do something with that pricing, whether or not you're doing that yourself or in the product, you still have to make those changes, right? And unless you really completely conform to how that product is doing this subscription billing and management, you will not really get the value out of that thing. And so that's what we're going to untangle for a bit, all right? Because the devil here is really in the details, and that is exactly the problem with portfolio management. The devil is quite often in the details, but most organizations approach it as this big picture only process. So if we prioritize that problem of having to go to a team, right, to ask them, hey, can you change the prices or this particular combination of packages, then just giving priorities doesn't really improve anything, right? Because what quite often happens is that the priority lane then just is more stuffed than the actual regular next action list. This is, by the way, real. And so it doesn't really address the underlying problem, right? It doesn't really address the fact that you have a constraint in the landscape. It is the constraint in the landscape that limits what can or cannot be done. So let's visualize that for a moment using Wardley maps. So here we see that particular company, right? And when we're talking about Wardley maps, we always say focus on the user needs. And one of the interesting things I like to do is quite often the user need is the organization itself, right? So in this case, it's our company, right? That is the user, and immediately below it, we have the user need of growing the revenue, right? And in order to do that, we need a bunch of different things, right? We need growth hacking. We need that team of very smart people that figure out ways to squeeze out more from the market. And we need billing, right? And in order to do growth hacking, we need price experiments, and price experiments in themselves need billing, right? And so we now already start to see how these different elements of the process are related. And billing, well, it needs subscriptions on one hand and add-ons on the other. And that needs usage, right? How much have you actually consumed of our services? And that in itself needs, like, what type of service offerings do we have? And, well, there are a lot more details to this, but these are the ones that matter in this particular situation. And obviously, the challenge when you're doing this is figuring out exactly just that, right? When you're modeling, when you're making a map like this, you're modeling, and you have to find out, like, which details matter and which don't, right? And that means that you should sometimes allow yourself to venture off path and put things on the map, and later on realize these don't matter. So in the executive summary that you're now getting, I took them off. So we see that certain things here are in the custom build column, right? So we see that the problem that we perceive is more or less over here, right? The fact that the combination of a subscription and an add-on defines the price that goes on the invoice, right? That billing needs to use. But these things are custom defined. Now, having this, right, situational awareness starts to increase constraint awareness. So we can now talk about the fact that we want to go from billing to billing as a service, right? We want to evolve the landscape here, right? We want to replace our custom-built solution with a product in the market, right? That allows us to do this. And we see what connections we still are left with, right? We do know that we do somehow need to get the consumption of our services in that platform, right? It doesn't just magically solve all our problems. We still have a dependency, right? And over time, what we're after, right? This is our sort of like really future state that we're after. So maybe someone in the organization thinks, you know what? We're practicing domain-driven design. I want an anti-corruption layer. Because who knows, this billing and subscription platform that we're buying, they may go bankrupt. And if they go bankrupt, we cannot invoice, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to build an anti-corruption layer with its own little model, right, to deal with the needs of billing and subscription management. And that way, if this company goes bankrupt or if we want to pick another vendor, then we can easily switch, right? You with me? All right. Who would like to do that, actually? Raise your hands. Or who would like to not do that? Raise your hands. It depends, right? The classic consultant answer. That's my answer. You should always say, it depends of what. Right back at you. So, there can be valid reasons to do something like that, right? If you're really uncertain about the vendor choice that you've made, perhaps that is a sane choice, right? But in this case, they spent actually quite a bit of time picking a vendor, right? And in this case, I would actually argue that it's suboptimal. And the reason for it is the fact that the constraint that we were trying to deal with was the fact that there was a team that growth hackers had to go to say, wait a minute, we want to change something about an email or the composition of this price offering. And every time they had to do that, they had to go to a team and it had to be put on the backlog and they'll figure out what to do. And then over time it would get done, right? But that was not sort of the immediate feedback loop that these growth hackers are after, right? And now if we start to introduce an anti-corruption layer, it seems like we're isolating ourselves from that particular product. But what we're also doing is we're robbing us of all that the product has to offer that our anti-corruption layer cannot deal with. Now, maybe initially that's not a problem because you're going to make this anti-corruption layer feature complete for the product that you bought. Sounds expensive, but let's assume for a moment that you do. Then still, the value that you get from buying something in a competitive marketplace is that it's not a static thing that you're buying. They can micro-optimize that problem like crazy. And so you hope and expect to get like a better value proposition of this thing over time. And with every feature that they add, you have to ask yourself, this anti-corruption layer, is that actually still able to deal with that, right? And so the constraint is right back into our platform. So it is still here, right? We've changed something, but the constraint wasn't really taken into account. I just want to make sure, who's puzzled? Like, if you are, raise your hand, because if that's the case, then I will just slow down with the next slide, just to really make sure that you're all still with me, because the devil is in the details. All right. So if we understand where that constraint is, right, then it's constraint alleviation that should drive the sequencing of initiatives in our portfolio management process, right? We should talk about the fact that this is really how we'd like it to be, without that anti-corruption layer, where we really want to say we want to be conformist to whatever model this billing as a service product ships with. And then we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean for the rest of the ecosystem, right? And that maybe means that we have to make changes in our software, but it could also easily be something that has to change in the way we work, right? Because some of the things that we want no longer fit with what we're conforming to, right? So being conformist in that sense extends in this case to more than just your software system, right? So, and that is actually the inertia that you can sort of visualize, right? That's what makes the change going from your own custom solution to that product over time a slow endeavor. So, the constraint is there. And there are different ways to surrender to the constraint, right? We can be conformist, right? Another thing is that we might just change our needs, right? And our expectations of what we want to have. And probably there are more things that we could do in this specific situation, but well, that's outside of the scope of this particular conversation that we are having here. This is just an example to illustrate. So when we have that, that is the moment when we can say, all right, we would like to use the domain-driven design patterns, principles, and practices to align the systems to the value stream and to surrender to the constraint, right? And we can do that by hiding problems behind abstractions initially, right? Whether we do that in models, right, with sticky notes when we're doing event storming, for example, right? Or whether we do that using other techniques. For example, in the Wardley map that I've shown you, right, components on that Wardley map can be simple ways to abstract very big problems, right? And maybe sometimes you have a system that deals with multiple responsibilities, but there is a conceptual differentiation that you could make, and you can easily use that modeling medium to express that. And then once you have that, you can shift the boundaries in due time with high quality engineering, right? Once you know where your constraint is, you know how you want to deal with it, and you know where you should be spending that high quality engineering time to get to the result, right? And it works especially well if you start to do these things sort of really outcome based, right? Where the way you're testing your system is very outcome oriented and not coupled to your implementation. And with that, you start to really surrender to the constraint. We design to alleviate the constraint, but we have to take it as a reality, right? You cannot remove the constraint, right? And so we use DDD to hide problems behind abstractions, right? And then once we've done that, to shift boundaries in due time, step by step, with that high quality engineering that uses those abstractions that we've introduced. And with that, we're surrendering to the constraint. All right. So, in theory, right? What was the solution? Well, Wardley mapping to gain situational awareness, as I've shown you, right? And then domain-driven design to shift those boundaries over time. And then portfolio management as a way to constrain that work in process and to make sure that we are focusing on alleviating the constraint rather than prioritizing. But, like I said, theory isn't practice, right? In practice, what's going to happen is something like this, right? So there's a great quote by Romeo Mora. In portfolio management, you are either grieving or you're lying to yourself, right? So you're either sad for the fact of all the things you cannot do that you want to do because you have to focus on other things first, right? Because you can only do so much at once, and specifically when dealing with constraints. Or, if not, you're lying to yourself. And it's important to remember that that portfolio management process, right, it happens at an organizational level. So it happens on one hand in the business, in product, and in engineering. But it also happens at different layers, right? Leadership, management, and also the team. And with that, one way to think about it is if you want to be effective, right? There are 9 people involved here at least, and they can be 9 allies, right? Now, I don't expect that you will be able to score your bingo card in full, right? But at least being aware of which of these people at which levels are understanding the problem that you're facing with the constraints in your ecosystem will help you have a more productive conversation, right? Now, quite often, any of these 9 allies will say, well, between you and me, we're really bad at this, right? Or we have a strategy, right? And there's this kind of sort of friction in there, right? The fact that, well, there quite often is a strategy, but more often than not, it's not really aligned with the constraint, right? And so that makes it really difficult. And other forces of friction are, as soon as you start to do something and it gets very big, you will very quickly lose engagement, right? Especially if you're doing this the first time around. So it's sort of the people that become, in that sense, the biggest bottleneck, right? The fact that if you cannot keep them engaged with this change that you're trying to make happen, then you will lose it, and in that process, you will not really be able to do any of this, right? So ironically enough, you do have to do something smaller first in order to retain the engagement and build up the trust. And then once you have that, you can start to do more ambitious things. Like the image before, we're remodeling an open store, right? We're changing the wheels while we're driving the car, right? And that makes for some really tough choices. And then in that process, right, everybody's trying to do their best. And a lot of teams, they will use the knowledge that they have and they will try to do their best, but they will sometimes have high perceived autonomy and go sort of off script, right? They will ignore the constraint, right? They will start to do things that actually put more stress on the system, right? For example, with building an anti-corruption layer, but it can also be in more subtle ways. And then the thing with all of this is we kind of say that we want to sort of be pool-based, right? We want to solve problems at a cadence where we're only solving one problem at a time. But in that, there is sort of this misalignment with the cadence of a portfolio management, which is typically aligned to the cadence of financial institution, right? Quarterly. And so there is a mismatch there. We kind of need an anti-corruption layer towards our finance world to be able to report on budgeting. And if you are operating in an organization where people have not been doing a lot of this work, right, and where things have been pretty tough and messy, most business owners will hold their cards really close to the chest. Like, yeah, I'm not going to show you what I have in my hands here, right? Because they know that they have to haggle and negotiate with pretty much everyone all the time. And so this is like real people friction that makes all of this stuff, in theory, very difficult. And finally, because of all of that, we're so numb to the pain, right? We get so continuously exposed to all these little paper cuts that it's actually very difficult to sort of escalate any of this, right? So you have to find new ways to stimulate the organization to actually be able to receive the signal that this is not how it's supposed to be. So, we have to deal with reality. We have to make problems visible in portfolio management, right? And one way to do that can be with a Wardley map, right? But obviously also through other mapping techniques, but my prime recommendation would be with the Wardley map. And we want to make tough decisions, right? If a team goes off rails, right, we want to give them very clear guardrails. We want to be human, but we want to also be very clear and decisive, right? Yes, you have autonomy, but you have autonomy within guardrails. And we want to iterate on implementation and adjust our strategy ongoingly. So again, basically what a DDDer does, just higher up in the stack. So, this kind of is the organizational equivalent of going to the gym, right? These are our dreams, right? 1st of January, I'm gonna get healthy, right? And this is our reality. So the thing is, you can't really go for that deadlift all at once of like 150 kilogram, right? You have to first address a small problem, build up a bit of skill, a bit of ability, a bit of strength, a bit of muscle memory, and build up iteratively, right? If not, what is going to happen is you're going to be that tumbling person. So, some final words. At the end of domain-driven design, there is this section of Eric Evans where he talks about, how some of the projects played out, right? And well, some of them were successes, others were not. And the same applies when we're doing portfolio management, right? Not everything will be a glorious success. We do want to aspire to that, of course, but it's important to keep this in mind, right? Portfolio management offers a structure to be a good manager, right? To be a good steward of the resources that we have to our availability in the organization, right? To be a good fiduciary. There's this great quote by Scott Galloway, and that is, a manager's task is difficult but simple. It is to allocate finite capital to generate a greater return than their peer groups get, right? It is the ability of that manager, right, to allocate capital in such a way that they're doing a better job than any of the other people that they're in competition with, right? So we want to have T-shaped people in teams, but that means, being good managers, right, in that sense. So we want to surrender to the constraint, right? We want to really be mindful of looking at our landscape, asking ourselves, what is the thing that is limiting the throughput here, right? And then ask ourselves, how could we alleviate that, right? And we do that by making that problem visible in a portfolio management process. And then when that happens, we will have to make some tough decisions, right? And that whether that means that you need to free up capacity to let people go, or whether that means that you have to be more directive to a team, even though you would like to manage them more through a position of trust and autonomy, there will be some tough decisions involved. And this is actually one of the things that I realized while I was preparing this talk. I was really looking in the mirror myself, right? So I understand that is difficult, but it is really something that makes or breaks the ability to succeed. And finally, we want to be mindful, just as we are when we're producing software, right? That we listen to the feedback that we're getting from what we're learning while we're implementing this, and adjust our strategy ongoingly, because strategy is iterative. All right? So, I hope that some of this will help you to be courageous, to make tough decisions, to make the jump, and I hope you will enjoy the view a bit. There are some additional resources that are in the slide deck that will be published. And if you like this presentation, then tell your friends, tell your boss, and tell the internet. And if you take the time to write a good question, then I'll take the time to write a good answer. Thank you.